Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 406. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to get through on today's show, mostly about the war in Ukraine, also a little bit about the China-Taiwan situation. As expected, China is conducting war games around the island in response to the Taiwanese president meeting with the Speaker of the House in the U.S. So all that and more on today's show. Share the show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute. You can find the show on the blog and antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. And it's up everywhere you can listen to podcasts. If you're new to the show, just be sure you subscribe to somewhere. If you've been listening for a while, try to share it out, get it out to somebody new, help the show to grow. You can also help out the show just by following myself on Twitter at @KyleAnzalone_. Not only do I post all the shows there, but also all the articles that I write, and usually each article will have a thread attached to it. So lots of stuff going on if you follow me on social media. And let's get into today's episode. First article off today, Stoltenberg says Ukraine must win the war to become a NATO member. This is NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. This was last Wednesday, and he said that in order to NATO's position is that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance, and that position has not changed. But we know there are at least two things you need to address to make that possible. One is we need to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation, Stoltenberg told reporters in Brussels. The second thing we need to address is that when this war ends and Ukraine prevails, then of course we need to ensure that we have the highest level interoperability, that Ukraine is able to move from Soviet-era standards, doctrines, and ways of operating their armed forces. Stoltenberg says the transition away from Soviet standards has already begun as Ukraine has been flooded with Western military equipment and has been receiving training from the U.S. and other NATO countries. Stoltenberg said the transition will be a long-term process, and this is something we've been talking about for a while, that Ukraine is effectively a NATO state at this point, de facto, if not an actual member of the alliance. So he went on to say the program is more long-term perspective that is about, building the institutions, helping with the transition and interoperability, the standards, the doctrines, all these things that we need to have in place also to move towards membership, he said. One of Russian President Vladimir Putin's main motivations for invading Ukraine was its potential NATO membership and cooperation with the alliance following the 2014 U.S.-backed coup that ousted Viktor Yanukovych. Before the invasion, Putin sought guarantees from the U.S. that Ukraine wouldn't ever join NATO, but the Biden administration refused to engage with Moscow on the issue. At the same time, the U.S. and NATO would not give Ukraine any concrete timeline on when it would become a member. This is from Zelensky in March. I requested them personally to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO in a year, 2, or 5. Just say it directly, clearly, or say no. And then the response was very clear. You're not going to be a NATO member, but publicly the door will remain open. And so this is what we talked about on the show, how, they're essentially dangling this carrot in front of Kiev to keep them fighting this war. But in reality, it doesn't seem like they're interested in ever really first helping Ukraine to win the war, if that's even possible. It seems like, as we talked about on the show, the goal really is to just keep the Ukrainians fighting and dying against Russians because they think it'll weaken Russia as well. But also, with this NATO membership, that they're still dangling in front of Ukraine, saying that, one day you'll get a membership, but in reality, that doesn't seem possible. Now, more on this here. Report U.S. pushing back against giving Ukraine a roadmap to NATO. This is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The Financial Times reported on Thursday that the U.S. is pushing back against an effort by some of its European allies to provide Ukraine with a roadmap towards NATO membership and an alliance summit this July that will be held in Lithuania. While NATO's position is that Ukraine will eventually become a member, Kiev has been given a timeline has never been given a timeline on when it could join. Sources told the Financial Times that some NATO countries, including Poland and the Baltic states, want to offer Kiev deeper ties and clear statements on its future membership. Polish President Duda has previously said that NATO should offer Ukraine post-war security guarantees. The Financial Times report said that Germany, the U.S., and Hungary are pushing back against these efforts, and NATO members are expected to be locked into negotiations on the issue until the summit is held. I guess that would be this July. Ukrainian President Zelensky has warned that he would only attend the summit if Kiev is presented with steps towards membership. NATO first promised Ukraine membership during 2008. William Burns, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time and now serves as CIA director, said in a cable that he sent to his boss Condoleezza Rice in 2008 that NATO membership for Ukraine is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said Wednesday that Ukraine must win the war against Russia and become interoperable with the alliance to become a member. And so it makes you wonder if maybe Stoltenberg is pushing the more hawkish line here, what the Poles, what the Baltic states are saying, when in reality, the major players of NATO, like the U.S., like Germany, are straight up refusing here. But this is problematic, and it's a part of the reason that we have this war in Ukraine in the first place. And it's really too bad that, these states aren't willing to negotiate on this, because it could really help to at least rein in the fighting, if not bring it to a complete end, by really willing to talk about how feasible it is to bring Ukraine into NATO. And if you admit that it's not feasible, making an official announcement of that really could help bring an end to this conflict. All right. Next up here, NATO to hold its largest ever air exercise in June. And NATO is preparing to hold its largest ever air exercises this June, known as Exercise Air Defender, that will involve 220 aircraft and 10,000 personnel from 24 NATO states. The drills will include a massive deployment of aircraft from the U.S. Air National Guard, which is tasked with defending the homeland, but according to Defense One, also maintains units for prompt mobilization during war. The exercises will mark the largest U.S. Air Force deployment to Europe for NATO drills since the alliance was founded in 1949. The purpose of the drills is to simulate what the U.S. would have to do if the war in Ukraine spread to NATO territory. And this is from the Air National Guard. This is now putting the alliance together quickly with a credible force to make sure that if Russia ever lines up on the NATO border, that we're ready to go. We're going to defend every inch. The drills will take place from June 12th to the 23rd and stretch from Iceland to Romania, with most of the fighters taking place over Germany and the North Sea. The massive show of force is a clear message to Russia and comes as the U.S. and NATO are escalating their support for the proxy war against Moscow and Ukraine. And of course, this may be less possible with aerial war games, but it's important to remember that the U.S., according to Seymour Hersh, used the cover of war games last summer to destroy the Nord Stream pipelines. And so if Russia brings, that up and says that that's one of their concerns about these war games, well, that's going to be kind of understandable, and it's going to be interesting to see, if these NATO countries carry out these war games, what the Russian response is going to be. So these are two stories that really work together. So the first story we have is Ukraine ready to talk about Crimea with Russia if counteroffensive succeeds. And this is according to an advisor of Zelensky that Kiev would be ready to negotiate the status of Crimea with Russia if it launches a successful counteroffensive and recaptures territory Russia controls that borders the peninsula. If we will succeed in achieving our strategic goals on the battlefield, and when we will be on the administrative border with Crimea. We are ready to open a diplomatic page on this issue, the deputy head of Zelensky's office said. He went on to say that the comments are the first sign. His comments are the first sign that Ukraine might be willing to seek a diplomatic solution with Russia over Crimea. Even though Crimea is pretty clearly a Russian red line, the people of Crimea pretty clearly want to be a part of Russia, that this is something that's established aside from the Russian invasion, that Crimea is a part of Russia and not Ukraine. Ukraine and Kiev have insisted throughout this war that a part of their war goals, a necessary part of their war goals, are to retake Crimea. And until that's done, they're saying that this war isn't going to end. So we had that story, but the next day we get this, and this is from Dave DeCamp again. A Ukrainian official said Thursday that Kiev's goal of kicking Russia out of Crimea hasn't changed, and the source told Politico Ukraine will choose to bring back Crimea using political and military means. And so this has happened a few times where you'll have a statement from a Ukrainian official that sounds more reasonable, a way to actually move forward and end this war, and then pretty quickly it gets walked back, even if that official is the president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And so we continue to get this, these signs that, maybe Ukraine's interested in talks, and then that's squashed pretty quickly. The first part of the statement sounded a little bit like what the U.S. had essentially been saying, that Ukraine needs to launch a counteroffensive, retake some territory, and then try to end the war from there. And now we're getting more of the hardline statement. And so you wonder maybe if one of these statements is for the U.S. and Western consumption, the other statement, the first one being for the U.S., and then this one being more of a reaction to Ukraine, where, my guess is that the hardline nationalists in Ukraine don't really want to give up any portion of Ukraine and are pressuring Zelensky not to. All right, next up, this is really important. Macron says he can count on Xi to bring Russia, Ukraine to the negotiating table. So here we have French President Emmanuel Macron telling the Chinese president in Beijing on Thursday that he can count on the Chinese leader to bring Russia to its senses and bring the warring sides in Ukraine to the negotiating table. I know I can count on you to bring Russia to its sense and bring everyone back to the negotiating table. We need to find lasting peace. I believe this is an important issue for China as well as it is for France and Europe. Following talks with Macron, she said China and France should work together to push for a political solution to end the war and avoid steps that would escalate the conflict. China is willing to call on the international community along with France to maintain rationality and restraint and avoid taking actions that will further escalate this crisis or make it out of control, the Chinese leader said. Macron made the trip to China with Ursula von der Linden, the EU's European Commission president. The EU Commission president said that she expressed a willingness to speak with the Ukrainian president and have a conversation when that could happen, when conditions are and time are right, she said. She emerged as a potential mediator between Russia and Ukraine after China released a 12-point peace plan for the conflict, and he traveled to Moscow to meet with the Russian president. Zelensky has maintained maximalist demands as preconditions for peace talks, but expressed an openness for China's proposal and wants to speak with Xi. President Biden has taken a much different approach to China's calls for peace by immediately rejecting the idea of Beijing as a mediator, and ahead of Xi's trip to Moscow, the White House came out against calls for a ceasefire in Ukraine. So, we have the U.S. directly saying we don't want this war to end, and China working very hard to see what they could do to bring the war to the end. Now, this is a pretty big story. and I haven't been sure exactly what to make of it, but I have this right up here by Dave DeCamp from yesterday. And as far as I could tell, I think Dave has some of the most important information here and has the right take on everything. So this from antiwar.com. Leaked documents appear to show NATO special operations forces are in Ukraine. A Pentagon document that has appeared on the internet as part of a trove of leads show the number of NATO special forces operators that are inside Ukraine, according to The Guardian. The Guardian report reads, on one slide, suggests that a small contingent of less than 100 special operations personnel from NATO members, France, America, Britain, and Latvia, are already active in Ukraine. According to a copy of the document circulating on Twitter, the authenticity of which has not been verified, there are 97 NATO special operator soldiers inside Ukraine, including 14 Americans. The French government denied on Saturday that its forces were inside Ukraine. There are no French forces engaged in Operation Ukraine. The document cited do not come from French armies. We do not comment on documents whose source is uncertain, and that is from the French defense minister's office. The New York Times first reported on Thursday the leaked documents that appeared online. The documents show U.S. planning for Ukrainians' counteroffensive and appear to be authentic as the Biden administration is scrambling and the Justice Department launched an investigation into the leak. A new batch of documents surfaced on Friday that extends beyond Ukraine and includes reports on China, North Korea, and Iran, and other areas around the world. According to the Washington Post, the Pentagon restricted the flow of intelligence in response. The U.S. officials said the move revealed a high level of panic among Pentagon leadership. The Post report said a slide that showed fewer Russian casualties than Ukrainian casualties appeared to be altered, but there were no indications that other documents were altered, which would imply the show that included the number of special operators in Ukraine. Western media outlets had previously reported on the presence of NATO special operation forces in Ukraine. The Intercept reported in October 2022 that there were U.S. special operation forces on the ground, and in June 2022, the New York Times reported there were a few dozen commandos from Britain, France, Canada, and Lithuania in Ukraine. All right, so that's all I have on those documents for now, as there's more confirmed information. Again, you know, it's very odd to me that this information is leaked with apparently one piece doctored, because it seems to come from the these documents obviously come from the United States, if they are authentic, or at least NATO. But at the same time, if that is being altered, then you would assume it would be by Moscow or someone who would alter to make it look like there's less Russians dying and more Ukrainians dying. And so for me, there's a lot of question marks here, and I want to understand a little bit more about the sourcing of the documents before I talk about them more. But I do think this is a very interesting story. So another very interesting story: the U.S. supported a failed Ukrainian attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. This is from the Times of London, and it detailed a failed Ukrainian offensive on the Russian-controlled Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, the ZNPP, that took place in October of 2022. About 600 Ukrainian Special Forces soldiers launched the attack from the northern bank of the Dnieper River and attempted to cross the water to reach the ZNPP. As the attack was launched, HIMARS rockets provided by the U.S. hit Russian positions on the southern bank of the river near the power plant. When the Times When asked by the Times that the U.S. had provided targeting data for the HIMARS before the raid, the Pentagon source said the U.S. provided time-sensitive intelligence to Ukrainian special forces. We do not share information with them, but they are responsible for their selection, prioritization, ultimate decision to engage threats, the source said. The dangerous assault on the ZMPP, which is Europe's largest power plant, failed as the bulk of the Ukrainian soldiers could not cross the river due to Russian fire. A small group of soldiers made it across and engaged in an hours-long fighter fight on the outskirts of the town where the plant is located. The raid took place on October 19th, and Russian media at the time quoted Russian military officials who said an attack on the ZMPP was thwarted. The Russian Defense Ministry said the assault involved 37 boats and craft with Ukrainian troops to land on the assault force, including 12 heavy and 25 light vessels. Russia accused Ukraine of attempting other similar attacks on ZMPP in September 2022. Officials said about 250 Ukrainian troops attempted to land near the plant, but that attack was thwarted as well. At the time, inspectors from the IAEA were stationed at the ZMPP. And so one of the reasons I think this is so important is because throughout the war, we've heard that this power plant was at risk, and it was at risk because of the Russians. But it's pretty clear that after Russia seized this in the opening days of the war, it's the Ukrainians who have launched attacks against the ZMPP, and would then be the ones who are risking the nuclear catastrophe coming from that plant. All right, this is the big story that I wrote over the weekend. U.S. will threaten Europe to implement sanctions on Russia. The White House plans to send a clear message to its European partners in the economic war against Russia. You are either with us or against us. Two Treasury officials will visit European and Central Asian partners next month to demand that all sanctions on Russia be implemented. Treasury officials Liz Rosenberg and Brian Nelson will meet with the leaders of financial institutions in Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. The AP reports the officials will have a simple message. 1. Continue to provide Moscow with material support, or keep doing business with countries that represent over 50% of the global economy. So again, you could either trade with Russia or you could trade with the West, is what they're saying here. Rosenberg and Nelson will provide European counterparts with intelligence on alleged sanctions evader if those countries fail to crack down on those still doing business with Russia. Then Washington is threatening to issue penalties. It is unclear how far the Joe Biden administration is willing to push NATO allies for violating sanctions. The policy echoes George W. Bush's doctrine that countries must either actively align with Washington in its Middle East wars or be judged as working with the terrorist. It is unclear how Europe will respond to the Joe Biden administration's threats. Some EU members were in favor of a plan that would lift sanctions on Belarus's fertilizer industry. And so, especially with this next part, I'm not so sure Europe's going to be willing to crack down more and adopt more sanctions. Additionally, stricter sanctions implementation could threaten the Black Sea grain export agreement. The deal brokered by Turkey and the UN last year allows for Ukraine's heavily mined Black Sea ports to export agricultural products. Moscow has been willing to extend the agreement several times, but is threatening to terminate it over Western sanctions, preventing Russia from reaping the agreement's benefits. After Russia invaded Ukraine last year, the White House unleashed a series of sanctions it considered an economic nuclear weapon. However, the attempt to isolate Moscow's economy has largely floundered. While the Russian ruble has dipped in recent days, throughout most of the war, Moscow has weathered the sanctions by increasing trade with Asia. Washington has only rallied its NATO allies and other close partners to adopt the sanctions. Meanwhile, China has added 2 more countries to its Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey are 2 of the latest prospective members. Upon becoming a member of the SCO, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi observed the more countries the U.S. sanctions, the more these targeted nations may cooperate as trading partners. He said this, I think it was back in September of last year. The relationship between countries that are sanctioned by the U.S., such as Iran, Russia, and other countries, can overcome many problems and issues and make them stronger. The Americans think whichever country they impose sanctions on, it will be stopped. Their perception is a wrong one. And this really echoes what I said in the I think the 4th episode of my old show, Foreign Policy Focus. This was back in 2017. The title of the episode is Sanctions Are Stupid and They Don't Work. And the idea that, if the U.S. really wants to, say, isolate Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, all those things are possible. Now, we've seen that sanctions don't force these governments to adopt a policy that the Americans want. They don't achieve their goals. But if you want to isolate those governments, it's probably more or less, something that the U.S. could pull off. However, when you sanctioned those countries, plus, Zimbabwe, Syria, Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, you get a very long list of countries, and then you have countries that do, what they consider essential business with Russia and China in particular. So you got India, Pakistan, and we could name a lot of other countries on this list, most of the African nations. And at this point, those countries aren't willing to cut off trade with the countries on the U.S. sanctions list, and so they just don't pick up the sanctions, and more these countries seem to be drifting towards these massive Asian-based trade organizations like the SCO. And so I think this is going to continue to happen in response to U.S. policy. It doesn't have to be this way, but as Daniel Larison has argued with the American sanctions policy, there's no where on the horizon it's going to change because of the way the American use sanctions, where even if, let's say, we put sanctions on Iran to try to get them to negotiate over their nuclear program, well, then the Obama administration does that, and then they agree to lift the sanctions, but now the Trump administration comes in, puts the sanctions back on for things unrelated to the nuclear program. It's just the way the U.S. sanctions policy works, that a government essentially has to undergo a regime change and adopt an American-friendly government before we will lift the sanctions. And as we've seen from Syria, that's just not going to happen. All right, so one last story on Ukraine real quick before we move on to China. Zelensky says Poland will form coalition to send warplanes to Ukraine. If this is true, it's a major escalation. Not sure if maybe this is meant by the more hawkish members of the NATO coalition in Ukraine to push other less countries that are less invested in the proxy war to additionally adopt the sanctions. But we have here Zelensky visiting Warsaw on Wednesday and saying he believes Poland will form a coalition of NATO countries to send warplanes to Kiev, as the Polish led the charge to provide Western-made tanks. Just your Polish leadership provides itself in the tank coalition. I believe it will manifest itself in the planes coalition, Zelensky said. Poland was the first country to pledge to send German-made Leopard tanks to Ukraine, which pressured German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to approve the export. Scholz eventually agreed to despite his earlier concerns of escalation, and Germany declined to send its own tanks to Ukraine. now they've decided to send their tanks to Ukraine, and some of those tanks have already been delivered. Poland's plan to send Leopard tanks are also resulted in the U.S. pledging to send Abrams tanks, and of course, we have the U.K. agreeing to send their Challenger tanks. Now let's move on and wrap up here with some important stories about China. As we predicted on this show last week, we are getting a Chinese military response to the Taiwanese president meeting with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in China. Now, this does seem to be a more muted response from China than the Pelosi visit that actually happened in Taiwan. So this is something that I believe was calculated on both sides. The U.S. holding this meeting in California rather than Taiwan, and then the Chinese reaction being a little bit smaller. But the exercises were announced by the China's People's Liberation Army, the PLA, as Tai returned to Taiwan during the first day of the drills on Saturday. The PLA was practicing its ability to seize control of the sea, air, and information around Taiwan. Shi Yi, spokesperson for the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, made clear that the drills were in response to Tai's meeting with McCarthy. This sends a serious warning against Taiwan independence, separatist forces, and their collusion with foreign forces to stir provocations. So this I think the meeting was a mistake. At the same time, hopefully there's a way for allowing tensions to de-escalate at this point. Interesting here, we already talked a little bit about what Marcone said while we're talking about the war in Ukraine. Now we have Marcone's comments on the situation in Taiwan, and he said Sunday that Europe should not follow the U.S. and risk a confrontation with China over Taiwan, as he was returning to France from a visit in Beijing where he met with the Chinese president. In a conversation with Politico, he said he discussed his desire for Europe to have a strategic autonomy and become a third superpower, which he said wouldn't be able to happen if Europe is involved in a conflict over Taiwan. He said that Europe faces greater risk if it gets caught up in crises that are not ours, which prevents it from building strategic autonomy. The French leader also said in a crisis, Europe might be overcome with panic and believe we are just the Americans' followers. He asked if a crisis over Taiwan would be in Europe's interest. The question Europeans need to answer is it in our interest to accelerate a crisis over Taiwan? No. The worst thing would be to think that we Europeans must be followers on this topic and take cues from the U.S. Agenda and Chinese overreaction, Marcone said. So this is interesting. At least there's somebody in the Western Bloc that is apparently reasonable on this issue. We don't have that in our Congress. We have Representative Michael McCall saying that sending troops to Taiwan would be a response that's on the table in the event of a Chinese attack. And last up here, I want to talk about this because initially on the show, I had talked about this possibility. I wrote this article that the U.S. was canceling its meetings with China over the spy balloon, and now the U.S. can't reschedule that meeting. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken is looking to reschedule his trip to China that he canceled over the Chinese balloon that wound up floating over the U.S., but Beijing is rebuffing the effort, Politico reported on Wednesday. The Politico report said China has effectively frozen high-level contacts with U.S. officials. An unnamed U.S. official said the Biden administration is also trying to schedule a call between Biden and Xi and other high-level officials to China, but Beijing isn't having it. Before the balloon incident, the U.S. and China were making a point to engage at high level despite soaring tensions, but since Blinken canceled his trip and the U.S. shot down the balloon, which ended up over U.S. territory due to unexpected weather, the progress on engagement with Beijing has been reversed. After the U.S. shot down the balloon in February, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin tried to contact his Chinese counterpart, who has since been replaced, but China declined to take Austin's call, and he hasn't had any luck since then. And then we have the new Chinese general who replaced Wei as the head of the Chinese Defense Ministry is sanctioned by the U.S., which is probably just going to add to the inability for these two sides to talk to each other. So, the U.S. isn't really interested in diplomacy. My guess is China assesses that the American officials are just going to travel overseas to yell at them, like has happened several times during the Biden administration so far. Similar happened on the Trump administration too. So who knows when it's going to be that these two sides engage in talks. Maybe Macron's visit could help to thaw the diplomatic freeze between the U.S. and China, but that remains to be seen. And it's part of the reason why the U.S. needs to use the set opportunities they have with China to engage in talks and not, plan meetings around crises, because China, as we've seen, just doesn't respond to that. It doesn't allow for talks around these crises and things like that. And so, we should have sent Blinken to China while the Chinese balloon was in the sky, rather than Austin trying to call his Chinese counterpart after the U.S. shot it down. But this is, part of what we talked about throughout the Biden administration, where we're really dealing with just a bunch of novices when it comes to diplomacy and foreign policy. They really don't seem to understand what realistic goals the U.S. could achieve in the world, and it's causing just problem after problem. All right, everybody, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Back with more shows later in the week.